For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to The Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan, and we are in the anniversary of the 1971 war, the 50th anniversary, and there is a view that a similar war on the same scale with Pakistan, between India and Pakistan, is not going to happen because of the nuclear issue and so many other things. So then how does one tackle Pakistani terrorism? We have some evidence of Balakot, but let's get into this a little deeper. I have my guest with me, Dr. Manpreet Sethi at the Center for Air Power Studies. She's a well-known writer and researcher on nuclear-related issues. Manpreet Sethi, glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Surya, for having me. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
First question. India's conventional military superiority was proven in the 1971 war. Yet for all that, we don't seem to be able to influence their policies or their attitude towards India, their thinking towards India. Why is that?
Well, certainly it's been 50 years, as you said, since 1971, and India's conventional military capability has grown significantly. But that is precisely the strength of India against which Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons. The military asymmetry, which Pakistan inherited, which led Muhammad Ali Jinnah at that time to say that we had inherited a moth-eaten Pakistan. They have tried to bridge that asymmetry with India in many ways, whether it was by joining SEATO or CENTO or by taking military capability from the US, taking help from Saudi Arabia for the money dimension of this. Despite all this, I think in 1971, Pakistan realized that it could not, despite whatever capability it had built up, fight and win a conventional war with a military superior India. So, two things eventually happened in the next decade. One, I think from the Pakistani side, the war went subconventional. So fomenting terror in India became the mainstay, wanting to, keep India unsettled through subconventional means of using the terror outfits that it began to nurture during this period of time in order to lead India. And the second thing that happened was the acquisition of nuclear weapons. And both of them actually reinforced each other, because if terror was to be used, weapons became the shield from behind which they could carry on their acts of terror, believing that India's superiority at the conventional level now would not matter, that they had managed to stymie India's conventional strength and to deter India from mounting a conventional attack of any kind. So nuclear weapons, in Pakistan's perception, became the great equalizer. And that has indeed made it difficult for India to employ its conventional capability and forced us to change the way in which we would be fighting future wars.
Okay. So it would seem that even through the Kargil war, in the final stages when we had the advantage, we didn't press home that advantage because of the nuclear shadow.
Well, indeed, Pakistan's nuclear weapons did weigh upon the minds of our political leadership at that time. But that's really not unnatural, because once nuclear weapons enter the equation, the manner in which one would employ force changes. And we've seen this happen everywhere, in every nuclear dyad. So the presence of nuclear weapons, which are really weapons of mass destruction, imposes a certain constraint on the way in which you would use that weapon and in the way in which you would also use conventional capability. So it was in 1999 that fighting, to evict the Pakistani army regulars who had come in to occupy the Kargil heights, India chose to use force in a constrained manner. So we imposed these constraints on ourselves and did not allow our air force to, go across the international border in any form when the operations were being carried out. But some important lessons, I think, were learned from Kargil. As far as Pakistan was concerned, it realized that it did not have a carte blanche on the use of terror, that it could not use it with the impunity that it thought that it would have with nuclear weapons in presence, and that India could respond. And for India, I think the lesson that came through was that we would have to change the manner in which we respond to Pakistan's acts of terrorism. So Kargil taught us that important dimension of how to fight a limited war. And soon thereafter, I think when Parakram had to be mounted in 2001-2 after the attack on the Indian Parliament, that further reinforced the lesson that we had learnt at Kargil, that force will have to be used differently. What did we see in Parakram? We saw full mobilization of our armed forces. And for nearly 1 year, they stayed in that kind of a position, and still, except for imposing a certain cost on Pakistan for their act of terrorism, we were not able to do anything. And we bore the cost of mobilization too as a result of that. So I think the point that came across through these two things that happened soon after both countries acquired nuclear weapons was that force will have to be applied, because Pakistan was going to continue to use terrorism, but the use of that force will have to be thought through in a different manner. And I think the whole traction of the idea of limited war came into the picture at that time. I remember being at an international conference where someone from the European world asked me about whether war is still possible between India and Pakistan, and my response was yes. Because the moment we concede that war is no longer possible, we played into the Pakistanis' hands. That's exactly what they wanted. But for India, the important thing is to use that instrument of war differently. And that's been, our challenge coming from then on.
So I'm going to come to that in a bit. But I'd like to ask you first, how would you rate Pakistan's nuclear capabilities as of today?
Pakistan has very intelligently built up a credible nuclear capability. They started out with the idea, as you know, of credible minimum deterrence, which is what India had stated in its nuclear doctrine also. But from then on, they've moved on to this concept of full spectrum deterrence, which is supposed to mean the capability to deter at every level of nuclear escalation. So they, talk about the so-called tactical nuclear weapons, which they believe they can use in, the small nuclear weapons, low-yield variety that can be used in the battlefield in order to stop advancing Indian troops into their territory. And at the same time, they want to have long-range strategic weapons as well, so that they can deep base them in their own country in order to reach deep into India. There are military leaders in Pakistan who've spoken about the need to reach as far as Andaman and Nicobar. So they're looking at, the Shaheen 3 class of missile, which would be something like 3,500 kilometers for a country, which is as small as Pakistan is. They have focused on survivability of their capability. So whether it's through mobility of their missiles or placing them in tunnels in the mountains, even going to the sea, even though they don't have SSBNs, and I don't think they will have them for some period of time. But the fact that they have started putting their nuclear-tipped missiles on their diesel-electric submarines, or even on their surface ships, the idea of all of this is in order to create risks of escalation. That if India does anything at the conventional level, whether on land or whether at sea, it is going to entangle them with the nuclear risk, entangle India with the nuclear risk, and therefore India will see it as a risk not worth taking. So escalation, even in response to an act of terrorism, will not take place. And that has been the focus of the build-up of their nuclear capability as well.
But they are aware that even one nuclear strike on us, because obviously I presume they will be the first to initiate a strike, it would invite full-scale retaliation. That is what we have, that's our stated posture.
That's right. Our doctrine states massive retaliation in response to any nuclear attack. So we don't make this distinction between tactical or strategic. We say any use of a nuclear weapon would get India to respond in the form of massive retaliation. And there is a lot of confusion about this. There are many people who question whether it would be credible for India to use massive retaliation. And my answer to that is, you are inviting the use of a weapon of mass destruction. So there is nothing small or big about this. Because at whatever level, even if you're starting at the so-called small level with low yield varieties, you are going to graduate very quickly to higher levels because the other side is going to perceive another attack, which will be of an higher order. So therefore, causing massive retaliation is the easiest thing to do with nuclear weapons because that is what they are meant for. And I think India has done itself very wise by having a doctrine of that nature, which suggests that we don't care about what you use. Once it is a nuclear weapons use, it is going to invoke massive retaliation. And that's
And do you
really the
believe-
only purpose of nuclear weapons.
And do you believe that has deterred Pakistan? You think they take our threats of retaliation seriously?
See, it is the business of every country to denigrate the doctrine of the other side, to say that
Yeah.
that's not a credible doctrine, and that's what Pakistan does. It does like to, suggest that this doctrine is not credible. But I think when you think through the military steps, if you were ever to use nuclear weapons, God forbid, if that was to happen, then very quickly you realize that massive retaliation is really the only credible strategy to have. And at the nuclear level, of course, I mean, the fact that we've not had a war with them at that level does
Yeah.
mean that we've managed to deter them.
But Kargil was a major conflict.
Kargil was a major conflict and undertaken by Pakistan with the assumption that they will be able to get away with it, that they would present India with a salami sliced fait accompli, and that India would not be able to do anything. And not just India, the international community would bear down on this situation. Because if you remember, this is the time when everyone was talking about these two new nuclear powers, which had created a nuclear flashpoint in this region, and that they will get into some kind of a fight with each other. And the fact that India managed to show restraint, to show that force is still possible to be used in the presence of nuclear weapons, got many countries back to the drawing boards to understand what this is going to mean for the region and how force can actually be applied. Because even during the Cold War, if you remember, the US and USSR used to talk about limited nuclear war. They didn't think about limited conventional war between the two of them. They were fighting proxy wars elsewhere. So the whole concept of limited war, I think, came back into the picture once India showed what it could do in Kargil.
So you mentioned earlier that there could be no more wars of the 1971 scale between India and Pakistan. And you believe that the nuclear overhang is one such issue. So how does one deal with Pakistani terrorism? We know about Balakot, but are we working on similar such, instruments or ways to deal with Pakistani terror?
I am sure we are. It cannot be that we are not thinking along these lines. In fact, I don't think there's reason to despair on how we are going to deter Pakistan. There are many things that India can do, and I always, put them along the DIME spectrum, the diplomatic, information, military, economic spectrum. And along all of these, there are many, many options that India can employ, and together, through a coordinated, coherent strategy along the DIME spectrum, I think India will be able to deter Pakistan effectively on its use of terror. It's going to be a long haul because it's such a low-cost strategy for Pakistan. They want to go ahead with their use because they've got the manpower to keep on, providing for this kind of a strategy. They've got the money to do it, and they've certainly got the intention to do it because the army keeps itself gainfully up in the stature in the political hierarchy by continuing something like this. But I think at the diplomatic level, if we can continue to keep the pressure on Pakistan, in today's times, the world acknowledges Pakistan as the terror machinery. So if we can continue to keep that pressure, use the instruments which are available, like the Financial Action Task Force, the UN Security Council resolutions, get countries like the US, which are looking favorably at India at this moment in time, to pitch for that kind of a pressure on Pakistan, that works. And in order to do that, you come to the information domain where I think India continuously, we bring out these dossiers when something has happened. But at
Yeah.
all moments in time, Pakistan is involved in such activity. If we can keep this out in the information domain at all moments in time, keep that pressure on Pakistan, I think it would work. And on the military front, where maximum amount of thinking has been needed, I think what is necessary is to conceptualize and to show the execution of use of military instrument in a manner in which Pakistan is punished for its actions, but which does not tempt it to use its nuclear weapons. So essentially, you're making the nuclear weapons redundant for Pakistan. They acquired nuclear weapons in order to deter India conventionally. But what India is suggesting is that my conventional actions can continue. I may need to change the nature of those conventional actions, but I can still use those instruments effectively. And if we can show that again and again, as we have managed to do with the surgical strikes and then with the airstrikes at Balakot, we are getting somewhere by denting the image of the Pakistan armed forces every time we do something like this. In the case of surgical strikes, as you remember, the army said it never happened. In the case of air strikes, the Air Force had to, protect its image. So we have to keep chipping away at the credibility of the armed forces in order to get somewhere to change the behavior of Pakistan.
But what about these little pinprick terrorist attacks that keep on happening? We've seen them over the course of the last month. Small attacks, maybe 1 or 2 people killed, 2, 3 people killed. They keep on happening all the time. There's no answer to that, is there?
Yeah, as I pointed out, it's a low-cost strategy for Pakistan, and it's not willing to give it up. So therefore, we have to bear the cost of it for some period of time, and keep on punching back. So every time something happens here, if something happens, across the border as well, things will begin to line up. And as I said, it's going to be the long haul. It's not going to be an easy solution. We haven't seen a case like Pakistan, India, where one nuclear weapon state foists terror on another nuclear weapon state. This is a rather unique situation. And therefore, we are trying to find our way around. I think by showing credibility of the use of force, even in the presence of nuclear weapons, therein lies our solution. So we have to keep searching for new options of how we are going to, use that force, kinetic, non-kinetic, a mix of the two. Everything will have to be sort of thought through very carefully to change that behavior over a period of time.
So you would say that it would take an attack of the Pulwama scale that would invite a retaliation from India in some form?
I wouldn't like to say it would be of that scale or not. I mean, it has to be that there is a message that goes across to the, across the border to suggest that this is intolerable, that, there's a cost for them to pay. And as I said, if it's a low-cost strategy for them, then we have to raise the costs for them. And this will have to happen, every once in a while when an attack on India takes place, irrespective of, whether you're going to suggest only a particular red line or a scale. I think that would defeat the purpose.
So you mentioned earlier that India is not going to go out there and say that war with Pakistan is no longer possible. We explain
not an option.
Not an option.
That war with Pakistan is no longer not an option. That there can be war, but that war will not be of the 1971 variety. That it will have to be fought differently with different instruments, which will, those instruments will have to show the strength of flexibility of use, calibrated use of force, quickness of deployment and disengagement, and at the same time, minimize collateral damage. So your instruments will have to be of that nature, and that's the kind of conventional capability that India must focus on.
So right now, would you say that we are trying to build that capability, still in the process?
Yes, we are. I think we are working on all the fronts, of capability build-up that fit the parameters that I've just mentioned to you. Because large-scale mobilization we've seen is not going to get us results.
Yeah.
In fact, the politico-military objective of any war in the future will not necessarily be territorial occupation, because even with territorial occupation, we cannot change Pakistan's behavior. And that's the purpose for which you want to use force. So therefore, different choices will have to be made on what those instruments are. And my recommendation would be that instead of focusing too much on nuclear buildup, which is really not usable, we need to focus much more on our conventional capability buildup of the kind which is usable. So your surgical strikes, your air power usage, your non-kinetic options, this is where we should put our energies and our focus, because these are really the usable instruments.
What about, say, the next kind of strike from Pakistan is not your usual terror attack. It's something like cyber related, targeting maybe public facilities or, things of that nature.
So there will have to be a response of some kind that goes in for this. Probably it will be a similar scale of response on the other end, using similar instruments. But I don't think we need to worry so much about what instrument would you be. I mean, in the public domain, we don't need to be concerned so much about which instrument gets used, as long as the focus is on building the right kinds of instruments, which are really the usable ones. So looking at these hypothetical situations and trying to envisage what would be used might not be a very useful exercise.
Okay. Last question. You think our military brass is now fully geared at, what the options are? They would have worked out by now. What are the other options available to us?
Well, I have no doubt that they have been thinking along these lines, because this situation has confronted us now for 20 years. There was a period immediately after Kargil when we did Op Parakram, when we were coming with the same mindset of the past, believing that this is the way that wars with Pakistan have traditionally been fought, and this is what will be necessary. But having gone through so many years thereafter, the change in thinking certainly has happened. I think more instruments have been considered. The wargaming exercises that happen in India have looked at all of these dimensions, which is why after the attacks at Pathankot, when we had the surgical strikes take place, we could use the air option for the first time since 1971 in the case of Balakot. So certainly this thinking has generated enough options in the military outfits, I think.
It's rather late in coming, isn't it?
Well, 20 years is not such a long time, Surya, for a country that faces the kind of challenges that we do. As I said, it's a unique situation. Nobody had ever envisaged that India would land up in this kind of a situation. And, right now we've not even spoken about the kind of help that Pakistan gets from China. And I'm not just talking about the material help, but the psychological support system that China provides to Pakistan, that it justifies everything that happens from Pakistan on India by saying that it was India that was creating that kind of an instability. So the kind of box that we seem to be in is extremely a difficult place to be. And countries like the US with their 2,000 think tanks just in Washington, D.C., with the kind of military capability they have run into the kinds of troubles that we've seen. So I don't think India is doing badly. We have to keep our flanks covered. We have to understand how to use force in these altered circumstances. And I think the biggest struggle in the first 5-6 years after acquiring nuclear weapons was to get that mindset change. Because the general understanding of the military was, we've got an instrument which is far, far superior to what Pakistan has in our conventional capability. And there's no way that, they can get the better of us. But nuclear weapons have changed the situation. To get us to understand that there is a change in the situation with nuclear weapons has been the biggest struggle. But I think that has filtered through, and we are looking at many other options today.
On that note, Manpreet Sethi, thank you very much for that insight. And as always, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
And to all of you out there who have followed this conversation, keep coming back to us with your comments, questions, and observations. Follow us on social media, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And just a reminder that we'll be back on January 3rd. We are taking a short break. So goodbye and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.